What if a memory you've carried for decades, clear as a photograph, heavy as grief, never happened at all? Picture a conference room in 2009. Not a dramatic courtroom or a laboratory filled with blinking machines. Just rows of chairs, coffee cups, name tags, polite conversation. A woman stands among strangers and says something simple, almost casual, the way people reference a widely known headline. She mentions Nelson Mandela's death in prison. Heads nod, faces tighten. Someone remembers the funeral. Someone else remembers the televised speeches, the sorrow that seemed to seep into the living room through the screen. A third person remembers riots, the sense of history collapsing inward, like a building losing its frame. It isn't one person guessing. It's many people agreeing, each one certain, each one seeing the same scene in their mind as if it was stitched into the fabric of the past. And then the room catches on a single snag of reality. Nelson Mandela is alive. He was released in 1990. He would become president of South Africa. The world would watch him walk out of prison, not be carried out in a coffin. The fact is not obscure. It's modern history, recorded in video and newspapers and school curricula. Yet in that room, memory stands its ground. This is the strange doorway into a phenomenon that later took on a name, the Mandela Effect. Not because it proved the universe was broken, but because it revealed something unsettling about the human mind. We don't store the past like a library stores books. We store it the way a storyteller stores a tale, through images, emotions, fragments, and meaning. And when we return to it, we don't simply retrieve it, we rebuild it. At first, the story seems like a parlor trick, a misunderstanding, a rumor, a mistaken news report that traveled too far. But the reports that followed didn't feel like ordinary confusion. People didn't say, "Maybe I got it wrong." They said, "I can see it. I remember how I felt." They described details with the confidence that usually belongs to lived experience. That's the first tension, and it's the one we'll keep circling. Memory is not just information. Memory is identity. It is the mental proof that we were there, at the event, in the era, inside our own lives. So when memory clashes with the record, it doesn't feel like being corrected. It feels like being erased. In the years after that conference, more examples surfaced. Cultural details that large groups of people remembered in the same incorrect way. A line from a childhood film spoken differently than everyone swore it was spoken. A famous mascot missing an accessory so many of us can picture. A brand logo that seems incomplete, as if a familiar shape has been removed. Even the imagined geography of a continent shifted in the mind's map. It's tempting to treat these discrepancies as jokes, but laughter is often a defense, because underneath the humor is a question with sharp edges. If our minds can agree on a vivid past that never existed, what does that say about the moments we trust most? Neuroscience tells us something even more unsettling. False memories can light up the brain in ways that resemble real ones. The mind does not stamp them with a warning label. They arrive with the same texture, the same emotional weight, the same certainty. And certainty, especially shared certainty, can feel like truth. This story isn't about proving anything paranormal. It's about exploring the gap between what happened and what we believe happened, about how culture, expectation, repetition, and emotion can sculpt memory into a shape that fits our inner logic better than the facts do. So let's begin with the simplest possibility and the hardest admission. Maybe the greatest mystery isn't whether reality changes. Maybe it's that we do, quietly, constantly, every time we remember. If the past can be rewritten inside millions of minds at once, what else have we agreed to know simply because it feels familiar? And if memory is a mirror, how often is it showing us ourselves rather than the world? Have you ever noticed how a crowd can breathe as one? Imagine a movie theater on a winter night, coats piled on laps, popcorn scent in the air. The screen flares to life, and a familiar character steps into a familiar scene. A line arrives, one you've repeated for years, one that lives in your home like an old saying. You mouth it before it's spoken. The audience around you murmurs in anticipation, ready for the shared moment. But the line lands differently. Not wildly, not dramatically, just enough to feel wrong in your bones. It's the same scene, the same character, the same cadence. Yet the words aren't the words you expected. Your mind stutters. Someone behind you whispers, "Wait, what?" Another person laughs uneasily, as if the film is playing a private joke. Outside, under streetlights, you check your phone. You search for the quote. The official transcript agrees with what you just heard. The internet has threads full of people insisting the older version was real. Some are angry, some are amused, some are quiet, as if they've discovered a hairline crack in the world. This is how the second door opens, not through prisons and presidents, but through the texture of everyday culture. Songs, logos, movie lines, children's books, things repeated so often they become mental furniture. The Mandela Effect thrives in the places where memory and identity overlap, childhood, nostalgia, the shared language of a generation. And here's the uncomfortable part. Many of these collective misrememberings begin in the same way memories often begin, with meaning, not precision. Your brain is not designed to be a perfect recorder. It's designed to help you survive and understand. It captures what matters, emotion, pattern, intention, and lets small details blur. When you remember a moment, you reconstruct it from pieces, the gist, the feeling, the familiar shape. It's less like replaying a video and more like restaging a play. That reconstruction happens fast, silently, convincingly. It's the reason a childhood home feels bigger in your mind than it is in real life. It's why you can remember the fear of a thunderstorm, but not the exact date. Memory is a living thing, constantly edited by new experiences. Now add culture. Culture is repetition. It is a chorus of references, jokes, imitations, parodies, remixes. A quote is repeated by comedians, rewritten in commercials, embroidered into memes. Over time, the simplified version becomes the version. Not because anyone is lying, but because the mind prefers a clean, catchy shape. The brain loves symmetry. It loves rhythm. It loves the line that sounds like it should be true. Sometimes a single misquote, spun through talk shows, playgrounds, and social media, can become more familiar than the original. Familiarity is powerful. It doesn't just make something easy to recall, it makes it feel correct. When you know something, you often mean you can picture it quickly and confidently. Speed of recall becomes a shortcut for truth, and once a memory is shared, it gains weight. There's a strange comfort in discovering that other people remember what you remember. It turns a private uncertainty into a communal certainty. You're not alone. You're part of a group. The mind relaxes into that belonging. Social agreement becomes a kind of evidence, even when the evidence is only more minds making the same reconstruction. This is why the Mandela Effect feels bigger than a simple mistake. It isn't one person confusing a detail. It's the unsettling experience of a whole crowd recognizing a phantom. But here's another layer. Sometimes the wrong version is the more emotionally satisfying one. It's more dramatic, more poetic, more neatly resolved. The mind often chooses the version that tells the better story. So the question becomes less cosmic and more intimate. If our memories are shaped by the stories we tell ourselves and each other, then how many of our certainties are really collaborations? And if millions of people can share the same misremembered line without ever meeting, what does that say about the invisible currents that move through us, shaping what we call reality? When you feel that tiny jolt, "This isn't how I remember it," are you witnessing a glitch in the world or a glimpse into how deeply human it is to build the past together? What if the mind's greatest talent, pattern making, is also the root of its most convincing illusions? Picture a child learning language. They hear a phrase once, then again, until the words fuse into something smooth and obvious. Soon the child is not just repeating sounds. They are predicting what comes next. Their brain becomes a machine for expectation. That same machine follows you into adulthood. You don't read every letter in a word. You recognize the shape. You don't analyze every facial muscle in a friend's expression. You recognize the mood. You don't calculate every step as you walk. You trust the rhythm. Pattern recognition is how we move quickly through life. It's how we understand a world too complex to remeasure every morning. But there is a trade. The brain that predicts is also the brain that fills in blanks. Now imagine those blanks as the soft spaces where Mandela Effect memories take root. A brand name that should be spelled a certain way because it matches the rules you've absorbed. A logo that should include an extra detail because your mind loves visual balance. A famous quote that should have a sharper punchline because that's how dialogue usually lands in stories. The brain leans toward what fits. It smooths, it corrects, it completes. This is why some incorrect memories feel so inevitable. They aren't random errors. They are the brain doing exactly what it was built to do, organizing the world into a clean, familiar pattern. There's a second mechanism, quieter but just as powerful, the way attention works. Think of a moment when you walked into a room and instantly sensed something, tension, warmth, danger, without noticing the details that created that feeling. Attention is selective. It shines like a flashlight, and everything outside the beam is dim. Most of life happens in that dimness. So when you recall a scene later, your mind reconstructs the missing parts. It uses what you know about similar scenes. It borrows from the world's typical architecture. Memory is not a photocopy, it's an educated guess. Here's where it becomes eerie. When thousands or millions of people share the same educated guess, it stops feeling like guesswork. It begins to feel like a parallel timeline, like something changed. But the shared nature of the mistake often has a simpler explanation. Shared inputs. We grew up on the same television. We learned from the same school posters. We heard the same jokes, the same parodies, the same second-hand retellings. Even when we think we are remembering privately, we are often remembering socially. The mind is porous. Culture seeps in. And then there's the third mechanism, the one that makes false memories feel so real. Emotion. Emotion is the highlighter of memory. Moments charged with fear, awe, embarrassment, or joy tend to stick. But emotion doesn't preserve detail, it preserves meaning. It preserves the story your mind told itself in the moment. This mattered, this hurt, this changed me. So when a false memory forms around something emotional, like the death of a world figure or a childhood line from a film you watched with your family. It arrives with all the force of genuine experience. Not because it is true, but because it is meaningful. Meaning is persuasive. If you want to feel how this works, try a small experiment inside your own mind. Think of a childhood room you haven't seen in years. The color of the walls, the placement of the bed, the angle of sunlight. Now ask yourself which parts you truly remember and which parts you are imagining because they fit. Most of us can't tell. That inability is not a flaw, it's a feature. The brain wasn't built to keep museum-grade records. It was built to keep you moving, learning, adapting. It is a storyteller, and storytellers are not accountants. Still, the Mandela Effect presses on a tender nerve. If memory is reconstructive, then certainty becomes suspect. And if certainty becomes suspect, what do we do with the things we feel most sure about? Maybe this is why people reach for bigger explanations, alternate realities, hidden rewrites, cosmic errors. Those ideas are dramatic, but they are also comforting in a strange way. They protect the self. They say, my memory is fine. The universe is the one that shifted. But the more human possibility is harder and more humbling. The universe stayed put, and we, together, changed the story we tell about it. So here's the question that lingers like a low note under the narration. If your mind can build a memory that feels like a photograph, how many of your photographs are actually paintings? And if the past is partly a work of imagination, where does truth end and the human need for coherence begin? It starts with something small. So small, you almost dismiss it. A logo on a cereal box, a children's book title, a famous cartoon character. You're standing in a grocery aisle or scrolling online, and your eyes catch on a detail that seems missing. You feel a faint irritation, like a note played slightly out of tune. You can't always name what's wrong at first. You just feel it. Then the mind provides the missing piece, almost automatically. It shows you the version you remember, the extra letter in the name, the accessory on the mascot, the color you swear used to be different. It's vivid enough to argue with the present. This is where memory and perception meet, a junction that feels like truth because it feels immediate. And yet perception is not a camera either. Your eyes don't see the world in full resolution. They sample it. They dart, they scan, they focus on what seems relevant. Meanwhile, your brain stitches those samples into a seamless experience. The world feels continuous, not because it arrives continuously, but because your mind is skilled at filling gaps. So a Mandela Effect moment can sometimes be less about memory and more about expectation, colliding with what you finally notice. Think of a long-used object you've never really studied, a familiar product you buy without reading the label, a title you've said aloud for years but never looked at carefully. The mind stores a rough outline, enough to recognize it, and then adds what makes sense when you recall it. That's the quiet power of the ordinary. We live among things we don't fully inspect. Now let's zoom out from the grocery aisle to the larger stage. The way information spreads. A misprint becomes a screenshot becomes a meme becomes a reference becomes a memory. And in a world where we consume thousands of small fragments a day, headlines, captions, clips, our minds have to compress reality into manageable shapes. The compression is not deliberate. It's survival in an era of endless input. So the Mandela Effect isn't just a curiosity about human brains, it's also a story about modern life, about what happens when the mind's ancient machinery meets the high-speed churn of culture. Sometimes the wrong version wins because it's repeated more, not because it's official, but because it's portable. It fits neatly into a joke. It sounds better in conversation. It's easier to remember. It travels like a catchy chorus, and when enough people repeat it, it begins to feel like the original. There's another twist here. We often trust confidence more than accuracy. When someone says, "I think it was like this," we lean away. But when someone says, "No, I'm sure," we lean in. Our brains read certainty as a sign of reliability. It's part of how social learning works. We copy the confident hunter, the confident parent, the confident guide. The problem is that confidence can be manufactured by familiarity. If you've heard a misquote 100 times, your brain retrieves it quickly. Quick retrieval feels like certainty. Certainty feels like truth. So the misquote becomes the memory, and the memory becomes the evidence. In this light, Mandela Effect experiences can be seen as cultural fossils, traces of how information moved through a generation. A misheard lyric shared on school buses, a parody repeated on late-night TV, a bootleg cover design that circulated more widely than the official one, a mistaken line that became famous because it was easier to say. And yet, this doesn't fully explain the emotional intensity people feel, because the real shock isn't that we can be wrong. The shock is that we can be wrong together. It's one thing to misremember alone. That feels like personal error, easily shrugged off. But when others mirror your misremembering, it feels like validation. And when reality contradicts that validation, it feels like betrayal. You start to wonder, if we can share an illusion this convincingly, what else do we share without realizing it? Not just facts, but narratives. Not just memories, but assumptions. In that sense, the Mandela Effect becomes a metaphor. It's not proof that history is malleable in a supernatural way. It's proof that human belief is malleable in a social way. We are creatures of community, and our minds are built to sync, sometimes beautifully, sometimes dangerously. So maybe the question isn't, did the universe change? Maybe it's, how did we change together? What forces, repetition, humor, nostalgia, trust, shape the shared pictures in our minds? And if we can collectively remember a small detail wrong, what happens when the details are not small at all? When they're the stories that define who we are? Where, in the end, do we draw the line between the past as it happened and the past as we agreed to remember it? What if the past is not a place we visit, but a place we continuously rebuild, brick by brick, without noticing our hands are moving? Imagine an old family photograph pulled from a drawer. The edges are soft, the colors slightly faded. You study the faces and feel the familiar warmth of recognition. You remember the day. You remember the weather. You remember the joke someone told just before the shutter clicked. But then a sibling walks in and says, "That wasn't the day you think it was." They point to a detail, an object in the background, a haircut, a calendar on the wall, and suddenly your memory trembles. The feeling remains, but the timeline shifts. This is the strange thing about memory. It can feel stable while being quietly flexible. You can be emotionally certain while factually wrong. The warmth of the moment is real, even if the story your mind wrapped around it is not. Now scale that up from a family photograph to a culture. A generation grows up with the same movies, the same books, the same commercials playing between shows. Certain images repeat so often they become landmarks inside the mind. They help us orient ourselves in time. I was young when that song was on the radio. I watched that film with my father. That logo was everywhere when my kids were small. These are not just memories of objects, they are memories of ourselves. So when the object seems to change, when the logo looks different, when the quote isn't the quote, it's not just a trivia question. It's a tremor through identity. It's the mind asking, quietly, if I can be wrong about that, what does that mean about who I was when I learned it? This is why the Mandela Effect often feels personal, even when it's public. It touches the intimate architecture of nostalgia. It nudges at the places where we store comfort, familiarity, and the sense of continuity. And continuity matters more than we admit. Most of us live with an unspoken assumption that life is a straight line. Childhood flows into adolescence, into adulthood, into whatever comes next. The details change, but the story holds. The past, in this view, is fixed, like a road behind you. Memory gives that impression. It arranges experiences into chapters. It edits away the dead air and leaves the meaning. It becomes, in a sense, your autobiography. But autobiographies are not raw footage. They're narratives. Every time you remember a moment, you are also remembering the last time you remembered it. Each recall is a rewrite, subtle but real. A detail is emphasized, another fades, a line becomes smoother, a scene becomes more symbolic. The brain is not trying to deceive you. It's trying to make the story coherent. Coherence is a kind of comfort. Now consider what happens when coherence breaks. When people discover a Mandela Effect mismatch, they often race to find others who share it. They search forums, watch compilations, read lists. There's relief when they find a crowd, not because the crowd proves the memory is true, but because the crowd proves they are not alone in the feeling. Alone, doubt feels like weakness. Together, doubt becomes a mystery. And mysteries are easier to bear than embarrassment. But there's a quiet risk here. The more you search for shared misrememberings, the more you prime your brain to adopt them. A suggestion, do you remember it this way, can plant a seed. A repeated image can become familiar. Familiarity becomes certainty. Certainty becomes memory. The mind is social not only in what it shares, but in what it absorbs. So the Mandela Effect sits at a crossroads. It is both a genuine psychological experience and a cultural feedback loop. It can begin with honest misremembering and then spread through exposure, reinforced by the comfort of belonging. This doesn't make it trivial. If anything, it makes it more revealing, because it shows us that memory is not just individual, it is communal. It is shaped by the stories we repeat together, the jokes we echo, the myths we prefer, the versions that feel better in the mouth. And it raises a subtle, haunting question. If the past we carry is partly a collaboration, who are we when the collaboration is wrong? Are we still the same person if our anchor points shift? Or is identity less like a fixed statue and more like a river, recognizable, continuous, and yet always changing, always moving, always rewriting its own path? When you look back at your life and feel certain of the story, how much of that certainty belongs to you, and how much belongs to the world that taught you how to remember? There's a moment in every investigation when you stop looking at the evidence and start looking at the investigator. In this story, that investigator is the mind itself. Picture a courtroom in your head. On one side, memory, vivid, confident, persuasive. On the other, the record, documents, footage, printed text, the cold certainty of what can be checked. Most of the time, the two agree well enough that we never notice the trial is happening. But the Mandela Effect forces a hearing. It asks you to take a witness stand and question something you usually treat as sacred, your own recollection. And in that questioning, a deeper truth emerges. The mind doesn't just remember, it edits, it defends, it protects. One of the mind's favorite tools is called confabulation, a word that sounds almost playful until you realize what it means. When the brain doesn't have a detail, it can generate one, not as a deliberate lie, but as a fill-in, a bridge over missing information. The result can feel seamless. The mind hates a blank space. It would rather invent a plausible detail than admit uncertainty. In everyday life, this is useful. It keeps your world coherent. It prevents constant hesitation. It helps you move through conversations and decisions without collapsing into "I don't know" every few seconds. But in the realm of memory, it can produce a convincing fiction. Now add another layer: source confusion. Sometimes you remember something accurately, but you remember it from the wrong place. A parody becomes the original. A rumor becomes the news. A later retelling becomes the first time you heard it. The content is familiar, but the source is blurred. And when the source blurs, certainty can still remain. This is why a misquote can feel real even when it's incorrect. You may have truly heard it on a comedy show, in a commercial, from a friend repeating it. The sound of it lodged in your mind. Later, the mind assigns it to the place that makes the most sense: the film, the song, the famous moment itself. The brain is not tracking citations, it's tracking meaning. And meaning, again, is persuasive. There's also something called the misinformation effect, when exposure to misleading information after an event changes what people later report remembering. It can happen with headlines, with conversational hints, even with questions that subtly imply an answer. "Do you remember the man holding the gun?" carries a different force than "Do you remember the man holding something?" One plants an image. Over time, that image can become part of memory. Not because you chose to accept it, but because your brain integrated it. Now consider the world we live in, a world of constant, post-event commentary. We don't just witness things, we witness the reactions to them. We don't just watch a clip, we watch a compilation of people watching the clip. The after-image spreads faster than the event. If memory is reconstructive, then the modern information ecosystem is a powerful reconstruction engine. And here's the most human part: we don't want to be wrong. Not just because being wrong is inconvenient, but because it threatens belonging. In many social settings, being wrong feels like being exposed. It can trigger shame. The mind protects against shame the way it protects against physical pain, by tightening, defending, refusing. So when someone encounters a Mandela Effect mismatch, the mind may resist correction, not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. It clings to the memory because letting it go feels like letting go of the self that carried it. This is why debates about small details can become strangely intense. It isn't about the detail, it's about what the detail represents: certainty, competence, continuity, trust in one's own experience. To question memory is to question the inner witness. And without that witness, how do we know who we are? Still, there's a quiet freedom in this discomfort, because if memory is not a rigid archive, then we are not locked inside our past. We can revise, we can reinterpret, we can heal. The same mechanism that produces errors can also produce resilience. The mind's flexibility is a double-edged gift. So perhaps the Mandela Effect is less a crack in reality and more a spotlight on an ancient truth. The past lives inside us, and anything that lives can change. The deeper question becomes, how do we live with that? How do we hold our memories with tenderness without mistaking them for unbreakable fact? How do we stay open to correction without dissolving into doubt? How do we respect the emotional reality of memory while acknowledging its fragility? If the mind is both storyteller and witness, can we learn to listen to it without surrendering to it? And what happens to a culture built on shared stories when we begin to recognize how easily stories can shift? It's late at night, and the glow of a screen becomes the modern campfire. A person sits alone, maybe in a quiet apartment, maybe in a house where everyone else has gone to sleep, and types a question into a search bar. It's not a grand philosophical query. It's small, almost embarrassed. Does anyone else remember it this way? Within seconds, replies appear. Strangers, scattered across states and time zones, answer with certainty, "Yes, me too. I swear, I can picture it. I remember the commercial. I remember my teacher saying it. I remember laughing with my brother." And just like that, a private doubt becomes a shared reality. The internet didn't invent the Mandela Effect, but it changed its shape. It gave it a home. It transformed scattered moments of misremembering into a visible pattern. Before, you might have noticed a mismatch and shrugged, chalking it up to time. Now you can find a crowd that mirrors your memory. The crowd becomes a mirror back, and mirrors are persuasive. But a mirror can also distort. Social spaces online amplify certain patterns. The most striking examples rise to the top. The ones that make people gasp or laugh get shared. Lists appear, compilations, video essays with dramatic music and urgent narration. Each repetition makes the false memory more familiar. Each familiar image feels more plausible. So the phenomenon feeds itself. It becomes not only a collection of memories, but a cultural genre. In that genre, the mind is both participant and audience. You watch a clip, read a thread, and suddenly you are scanning your own memory, searching for resonance. If you find it, you feel a spark. I knew it. If you don't, you feel left out, and the mind, so eager for belonging, may quietly adapt. This is not weakness. It's social cognition, doing what it always does. Humans are imitators. We learn by copying. We absorb language, accent, humor, and belief through contact with others. In the physical world, this happens slowly, over years, in families and communities. Online, it can happen in an afternoon. Shared images can reshape memory quickly, especially when paired with emotion and repetition. And emotion is never far away in these spaces. The Mandela Effect is often presented as playful, but underneath the play is an anxious question. If reality feels unstable, what can we trust? The internet is full of people craving certainty. In a world of shifting news cycles and endless information, a clean mystery can feel comforting. It offers a puzzle with edges. Sometimes, the Mandela Effect becomes a way to channel deeper unease, not about logos or movie lines, but about the speed of change itself, about the sense that the world you grew up in is fading, that the familiar is being replaced, not just in stores and screens, but in memory. In that sense, it used to be different becomes more than a claim. It becomes a mood. It's also a way to talk about something hard to name, the grief of time passing. When childhood objects look unfamiliar, it can feel like the past is slipping away. The Mandela Effect gives that grief a shape. It says, "It's not just me. Something shifted." That story can be soothing. It externalizes the loss. It turns aging into a cosmic glitch instead of a human inevitability. But there is a danger too. when we treat shared feelings as proof. Online communities can reinforce certainty without verification. They can reward the most dramatic interpretations. They can blur the line between curiosity and conviction. A gentle question, "Isn't it strange?" can harden into a confident claim. It was changed. And once a claim hardens, it becomes part of identity. People don't just believe it, they belong to it. Belonging can become more important than being right. Still, there's a more generous way to see this. Perhaps these communities, at their best, are not trying to rewrite history. They are trying to understand themselves. They are gathering around a shared vulnerability, the realization that the mind is not as reliable as we assumed. And that realization can be profound. Because once you accept that memory is flexible, you begin to see how easily narratives form. Not just about movie lines, but about people, events, and entire eras. You see how rumors become common knowledge, how repeated claims become assumed facts, how a story, told often enough, becomes indistinguishable from lived experience. The Mandela Effect is a small stage where a larger drama plays out. The human hunger for certainty, the social nature of belief, the way repetition can sculpt reality in the mind. So here's a question to sit with, like a lingering chord after the scene fades. When you find others who remember what you remember, does that make it true? Or does it reveal something even more interesting? The truth is often less about what happened and more about what we can persuade each other to feel certain about. In a world where memory can be crowdsourced, what becomes of the solitary witness inside you? Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, most of us make an unspoken deal with time. We accept that we will forget small things, phone numbers, faces from old classes, where we left our keys. In exchange, we assume the big things will remain. The outlines of history, the landmarks of culture, the moments that shaped the world. We treat those as fixed. But what if that deal was never real? Imagine a library where the shelves look stable, yet every book is written in ink that slowly rearranges itself. The titles stay familiar. The pages feel the same under your fingers, but line by line, the wording shifts to fit the reader's expectations. That's not how the world works, of course. Yet the metaphor captures something true about the mind. Memory is not stored as unchanging text. It is stored as a set of impressions, and those impressions can drift, especially when we revisit them through nostalgia. Nostalgia is not a simple yearning for the past. It is a form of storytelling. It compresses, beautifies, and arranges. It turns messy years into clean seasons. It removes the boredom, the confusion, the long stretches where nothing important happened. It keeps the moments that glow. This is why Mandela Effect memories often cluster around childhood touchstones. Those touchstones are not neutral facts. They are emotional anchors. They hold the feeling of being safe, young, unburdened. They remind us of a world that felt simpler, even if it wasn't. When those anchors seem to shift, it can feel like the past itself is being stolen. But another possibility is quieter and more human. We are not losing the past. We are encountering the difference between what we lived and what we've been carrying. There's a scene you can picture. A person finding an old VHS tape, a relic from a time when entertainment arrived with static and tracking lines. They put it in a player, dust rising in the sunlight. The screen flickers, and a movie they adored in childhood appears. And suddenly it looks different. Not because it changed, but because they did. The acting feels slower. The jokes land differently. The costumes look cheaper than memory allowed. The magical moments feel smaller. The film hasn't shifted. The viewer's mind has. This is one of the quiet shocks of adulthood, the realization that much of what we remember is not the thing itself, but the way we felt when we first met it. So when people insist a quote used to be different, they may be protecting that feeling. They may be defending the emotional memory, not the factual one. The emotional memory says, this mattered, this shaped me, this was part of my life, and that is true, even if the quote is not. This is where the Mandela Effect becomes less like a trivia glitch and more like a study of longing, a reminder that the past is not just behind us, it is inside us, aging with us, changing with us. But there's another reason these mismatches sting. They expose the limits of our control. We like to believe we have sovereignty over our own minds, that our experiences belong to us, that what we saw and felt is ours to keep. Yet memory is influenced by forces beyond us. Advertising, media repetition, social reinforcement. Even the language available to describe the past shapes what we recall. If you don't have a word for an experience, it can be harder to retrieve. If you repeat an interpretation often, it becomes the memory. In that sense, memory is not private property. It is a shared landscape. We live in it together. We plant stories there, and we harvest them later, sometimes forgetting who planted what. This is not a reason for paranoia. It's a reason for humility. Because humility changes the tone of the mystery. Instead of claiming the world is rewriting itself, we can say, the mind is rewriting its map, and that map is influenced by both personal life and public culture. The Mandela Effect, then, becomes a gentle invitation to revisit our assumptions about certainty, to recognize that being sure is not the same as being right, to hold our memories with care, not with clenched fists. So as we move deeper into this story, let's pause at the emotional center. When people argue fiercely over a logo or a line, they are often arguing over something larger. The feeling that the past should be reliable, that time should be trustworthy, that the self should be stable. But time is not trustworthy. It is beautiful and indifferent. And the self is not stable. It is alive. So here's the question that hangs in the quiet after the scene. If the past you remember is partly a story you've been telling yourself for years, what happens when you meet the original source and realize the story was edited? Do you let the record correct you? Or do you mourn the version of the past that lived so vividly inside you? And if you mourn it, what exactly are you mourning? The fact or the feeling it carried? Let's step out of the living room and into the newsroom. Picture a breaking headline flashing across a television in the late 1980s or early 1990s, the kind of news that interrupts regular programming. The tone of urgency, the grim seriousness of the anchor's face. In homes across the country, people pause what they're doing and watch history being narrated in real time. Years later, someone swears they remember that broadcast. Not vaguely, specifically, the words, the image, the emotional weight, as if the moment left a bruise. They remember where they were standing, who was in the room, the sense that something irreversible had occurred. And then they learn the broadcast never happened. Or rather, something happened, but not the way they recall. The timeline is different. The details are different. The breaking news moment is stitched together from separate events, separate headlines, separate stories that blended into one mental scene. This kind of memory is more common than we like to admit, because news, especially tragic news, arrives in fragments over time. It repeats, it updates, it replays footage. It reuses the same images while the story evolves. The mind absorbs the images and the emotion, then later compresses the whole sequence into a single, clean event. The memory feels like one night. In reality, it might have been weeks. This is how collective misremembering can form around major public events. Not because people are careless, but because the machinery of modern storytelling, news cycles, repetition, dramatic framing, encourages the mind to consolidate. And consolidation is a memory's natural move. The Mandela effect often gets discussed through playful examples, but its deeper, more unsettling edge appears when misremembering touches public history. When groups of people share a vivid memory of a political event, a celebrity death, a disaster, a court case, a famous speech, only to find the official record doesn't match. At that point, the stakes feel higher. The question becomes, if we can collectively misremember history, how do we know what we actually lived through? This is where the phenomenon brushes up against something older than the internet, the way societies remember. Every culture has collective memory, stories that define identity, explain values, and locate a people in time. But collective memory is not the same as the full historical record. It is selective. It highlights certain moments and quietly sets others aside. It creates heroes, turning points, and lessons. In a sense, collective memory is history shaped into meaning. That shaping is not always dishonest. Sometimes it's necessary. A society needs narratives to teach, to mourn, to celebrate, to warn. But the process can distort. It can simplify complex events into moral tales. It can blur causes and effects. It can turn uncertainty into certainty, because uncertainty is hard to live with. Now consider how this interacts with the Mandela effect. If individual memory is reconstructive, then collective memory is reconstructive at scale. It is the mind's tendency to create coherence, multiplied across millions of people, reinforced by media, education, and social reinforcement. In that light, the Mandela effect becomes one small, visible example of a much larger pattern. Humans are meaning makers. We turn time into story, and once time becomes story, it becomes vulnerable to revision. This doesn't mean reality is subjective. It means our relationship to reality is mediated. We encounter history through narrators, through editors, through cameras that point one way and not another, through lessons that emphasize certain facts and omit others, through conversations in which people repeat what they've heard, trusting that repetition equals truth. And because we trust, we remember. So when a Mandela-style mismatch appears in public history, it can feel like an existential tremor. It suggests the possibility that the past we carry is partly a cultural agreement, not an evil conspiracy, not a secret rewrite, but the natural outcome of social storytelling. And social storytelling is powerful. It can unify, it can heal, it can also mislead. It can make us certain of things that never happened, simply because the story is compelling and widely repeated. This is why the Mandela effect, at its most serious, isn't about trivia. It's about epistemology, the question of how we know what we know, how we verify, how we remain humble without becoming cynical. Because if memory and shared belief are both fallible, then we need something else. Methods, records, cross-checking, openness to correction, a willingness to say, I felt it, but I may be wrong. That willingness is rare. It requires maturity. It requires the courage to separate identity from certainty. So here is the tension we carry forward. The human heart wants a past it can trust, and the human mind builds a past it can live with. Sometimes those are the same. Sometimes they are not. When the record contradicts the memory, which do we protect? The truth or the meaning we built around it? And if the meaning matters, can we hold it gently without insisting it is fact? What would it look like to be faithful to our feelings while still being loyal to reality? There's a particular kind of silence that follows the words, "You're mistaken." Not the silence of embarrassment alone, but the silence of a shaken foundation. Because being mistaken about a memory isn't like being mistaken about a statistic. It feels like being told your inner witness can't be trusted. For some people, that feeling is intolerable. So the mind reaches for a larger frame, one that protects the self from doubt. If the memory is vivid and shared, then the logic goes, perhaps the world is the one that changed. Perhaps there are alternate timelines. Perhaps reality branched. Perhaps history was rewritten. These ideas can sound fantastical, but they also serve a psychological function. They preserve dignity. They restore coherence. They say, my mind isn't failing. The universe is complex. It's a kind of consolation story. And in a world where physics itself can sound like science fiction, where particles behave strangely and time can bend under gravity, it's easy for imagination to leap from the mysteries of the microscopic to the mysteries of memory. But this is where we need to slow down and breathe. The Mandela Effect, as a lived experience, is real. People genuinely remember things differently. The emotional certainty is real. The shared nature of it is real. What's not automatically real is the explanation we choose. Human beings have always built explanations to match the size of their feelings. When something feels huge, we want a huge cause. A small cause can feel insulting. If your memory of a beloved childhood film is wrong, it can feel too mundane to say, my brain filled in a blank. The heart wants a reason that honors the intensity. So the mind offers cosmic narratives. And yet the simplest narratives are often the most faithful to what we know about cognition. Memory is reconstructive. Perception is selective. Culture is repetitive. And suggestion is powerful. None of that is dramatic, but it is deeply human. And it accounts for the phenomenon without requiring reality to fracture. Still, we shouldn't dismiss the cosmic narratives with ridicule. Ridicule closes the conversation. The better move is to understand the hunger beneath them. The hunger is for stability. Many adults carry a quiet anxiety about change. The world feels faster than it used to. Technology reshapes daily life. Institutions feel less reliable. Even language shifts under our feet. In that landscape, a Mandela Effect moment can feel like a symbol, proof that nothing is solid, not even the past. If the past can't be trusted, what can? So alternate reality explanations can be less about science and more about emotion, a way to express the feeling that the ground is moving. There's also a more subtle motivation: wonder. People want mystery. They want the world to be bigger than the routine of schedules and bills. The Mandela Effect offers a door into strangeness that feels accessible. You don't need a laboratory. You just need a memory and a mismatch. Suddenly, you're in a story where reality itself might be pliable. That can be intoxicating. But wonder has a shadow when it hardens into certainty. When curiosity becomes conviction, the mind can begin to treat disagreement as threat. And once threat enters, it's easy to slip into suspicion, to see hidden hands and deliberate rewrites everywhere. That shift can drain the phenomenon of its most valuable gift: humility. Because the most useful lesson here isn't that reality is unstable. It's that our certainty is. If we can be wrong about something as small as a logo detail, then we should be gentle about our confidence in bigger matters. That gentleness is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's the recognition that human perception is limited and that truth often requires patience and verification. And verification is not the enemy of wonder. In a mature mind, verification deepens wonder. It helps us marvel at what is actually true, not merely what we wish were true. So what do we do with the cosmic stories? We can treat them as metaphors, not as literal claims, but as symbolic expressions of a real human experience, the experience of feeling the past shift beneath you. In that metaphorical sense, alternate timelines becomes a poetic way of saying, I'm startled by how my mind works. And that is a kind of truth. The Mandela Effect doesn't have to be an argument about physics. It can be a meditation on consciousness, a reminder that reality is filtered through human senses and that our internal world is both powerful and fragile. So here's a question that lingers at the edge of belief. When you encounter a mismatch, do you reach outward toward cosmic explanations that protect your certainty? Or do you reach inward toward the humbler, harder realization that your mind is not a perfect mirror? And if the humbler realization is true, what becomes possible? What would it look like to live with a mind that can be wrong and still be worthy of trust? If you want to understand how a false memory can feel real, don't start with the internet. Start with a simple room, a table, two people telling a story. One person says, "Remember that time we," and the other smiles, nodding, already filling in the scene. They add a detail. The first person adds another. Soon, the story becomes a shared creation. Two imaginations stitching together a single past. Later, each person will swear the story is exactly what happened. Not because they're lying, but because they rehearsed it. They repeated it. They polished it. The shared version became the official version in their minds. This is the quiet truth. Memory loves rehearsal. The more you recall something, the more you reinforce it. But what you reinforce is not the original event. You reinforce the version you recalled. Memory is like a path in a forest. The more you walk it, the clearer it becomes, even if it wasn't the path you intended. Now imagine this happening not between two friends, but across a society. A misquote is repeated. A logo detail is misremembered in a popular parody. A mistaken fact appears in a classroom worksheet, a magazine, a social post. None of these moments alone would matter, but together they create rehearsal. They create repetition. And repetition is a sculptor. There's a particularly strange phenomenon. When people are shown a false detail alongside a true one, they can later remember the false detail with surprising confidence. The brain treats it as familiar. Familiar becomes believable. Believable becomes memory. This doesn't require manipulation. It can happen casually, through ordinary exposure. In a world where information is shared at scale, the conditions for this are everywhere. So the Mandela Effect is not just a collection of odd memories. It is a portrait of how belief can spread, how it can become vivid and stable in the mind without being historically accurate. That portrait is worth studying because it points to something larger: the fragility of consensus reality. Consensus reality is the shared agreement about what is true. We don't each verify everything personally. We trust institutions, records, experts, and each other. That trust is what allows society to function. You don't test the structural integrity of every bridge you cross. You trust the system. But trust depends on credibility, and credibility can be shaken. When people discover a Mandela Effect mismatch, They sometimes feel that shake in miniature. If a small detail can be different than remembered, what about larger ones? The mind can slide from "I misremembered" to "maybe I can't trust the record" to "maybe the record is being altered." Most of the time, this slide is emotional, not logical. It's the feeling of disorientation, seeking an explanation that restores control. And control is a deep human craving. What makes the Mandela Effect so culturally potent is that it arrives at a time when many people already feel distrustful. News is contested. Information is weaponized. Deepfakes and edited clips blur authenticity. Even without believing in hidden rewrites, many people feel the ground of what's true is less solid than it used to be. So a memory mismatch doesn't land in a vacuum. It lands in a climate. In that climate, the Mandela Effect can become a symbol, a small example used to support a larger fear that reality is being manipulated. Again, this doesn't require conspiracy to be psychologically real. It's how symbols work. They condense complex feelings into a simple image. But there's another way to read the symbol, one that leads not to fear, but to responsibility. If memory and belief are this malleable, then we have an ethical obligation to handle claims carefully, to check before we share, to avoid turning personal certainty into public fact, to recognize the difference between "I remember" and "it happened." That difference sounds small. It is enormous. It is the difference between humility and misinformation. And in a world where narratives can travel faster than verification, humility is not just a virtue, it is a safeguard. So the Mandela Effect asks us to become better witnesses. Not perfect witnesses. Human beings will never be perfect witnesses, but more honest ones. Witnesses who can say, "This is how I remember it," and also say, "I may be wrong." That kind of speech is rare because it doesn't perform confidence. It doesn't win arguments easily, but it builds something deeper: trust. Trust doesn't come from never being wrong. It comes from being willing to correct. So here's the open question at the end of this chapter. If our minds can rehearse an illusion until it feels like truth, what practices help us stay grounded? What habits, personal and cultural, keep us close to reality without stripping away wonder? And if we learn those habits, would the Mandela Effect feel less like a glitch and more like a lesson in how to live wisely inside a mind that is always quietly rewriting? At some point, the mystery stops being about the world and starts being about us. Because the more you look at the Mandela Effect, the more it resembles an echo of how humans handle uncertainty, disagreement, and the slippery nature of truth. Picture a long dinner table, family members, old friends. Someone brings up a memory, a holiday, a road trip, a funny disaster that's been told 100 times. Everyone leans in. And then the first contradiction appears. That's not how it happened. A second person insists on a different version. A third person swears both are wrong. Voices rise. Someone laughs. Someone feels insulted. The argument becomes more heated than the moment deserves. Why? Because the past is a battleground for identity. Whoever controls the story controls the meaning. And meaning matters. Meaning tells you who you were, who your family was, who the group is. A disagreement over memory can feel like a disagreement over belonging. Now expand that table to a nation, to an era, to a whole online world. The Mandela Effect becomes a small, safe proxy for a larger struggle. The struggle over how we decide what's true when we can't all agree. In that sense, the phenomenon is not only psychological, it is cultural. It reveals that people don't just want facts, they want narratives that feel trustworthy. They want a sense that their lived experience has value. They want to feel that their inner witness counts. And when the record contradicts that witness, it can feel like the record is hostile. But there's a deeper tension still. Human beings are not built to live comfortably with ambiguity. Ambiguity is cognitively expensive. It burns mental energy. It creates anxiety. The brain prefers closure, even if the closure is imperfect. This is why a tidy, wrong answer can feel more satisfying than a complicated truth. The mind would rather land somewhere than hover. So when a Mandela Effect mismatch appears, the mind searches for closure. It may accept the official record and feel slightly foolish, or it may reject the record and feel empowered. The second option is emotionally easier for many people because it restores certainty and pride. Yet certainty built on rejection can become a trap. It can turn curiosity into defensiveness. The best version of this phenomenon, the most useful one, is not the one that fuels argument. It's the one that opens empathy. Because once you accept that memory is fragile, you begin to understand why people disagree so fiercely about larger histories. You begin to see how two people can witness the same event and walk away with different truths, not because one is evil, but because perception filters reality through different fears, values, and attention. This insight doesn't solve disagreement, but it softens it. It helps us ask better questions, not, "How can you believe that?" but, "What did you experience that led you there?" Not, "You're lying," but, "We may be remembering differently. How do we check?" In a mature culture, the answer is not to worship memory or dismiss it. It is to balance it with evidence, to respect feeling while seeking verification. That balance is hard because it requires patience, and patience is rare in fast-moving spaces. But it is also hopeful, because if the Mandela Effect teaches anything, it's that human beings share vulnerabilities. We are all susceptible to suggestion. We all build narratives. We all want the past to make sense. Recognizing that shared vulnerability can become a bridge. It can turn the phenomenon into a meditation on compassion. If my mind can be wrong with confidence, then perhaps I should treat other people's confidence with gentleness, not with blind acceptance, but with understanding. And then there's one more layer, the quietest one. Sometimes we cling to a false memory because it points toward a truth we can't say directly. A longing for childhood, a desire for stability, a fear that time is running faster than we can hold, a sense that the world we knew is slipping away, replaced by something unfamiliar. In that reading, the Mandela Effect is not a puzzle about logos. It's a language for grief. Grief for the versions of ourselves we no longer are. Grief for the idea that the past was fixed and safe. If that's true, then the solution isn't to debunk people into silence. It's to honor the grief while clarifying the facts. To say your feeling is real, even if your detail is not. Your nostalgia matters, even if the quote changed in your mind. Your sense of dislocation deserves attention, not mockery. So here's the question that emerges when we stop treating the Mandela Effect as entertainment and start treating it as a mirror. If collective misremembering is partly a social process, then what kind of society do we want to build? One that rewards loud certainty, or one that rewards careful truth? And inside your own life, when you discover you were wrong about a memory, can you let the correction be gentle? Can you allow yourself to be human, fallible, curious, still worthy? Or will you demand a certainty so rigid that it leaves no room for growth? There is a quieter version of the Mandela effect that almost never makes it into lists. It doesn't involve famous logos or movie lines. It happens in ordinary lives, in places no one archives. A person returns to their childhood neighborhood after 20 years. They drive slowly, expecting the streets to curve the way they remember, expecting the hill to rise at a certain point, expecting a tree to stand like an old guardian near the corner. But the hill feels smaller, the street feels narrower. The tree is gone. The house that once felt huge looks modest now, almost shy. They tell themselves the neighborhood changed, and it did, a little. But the more haunting change is internal. The mind's map was drawn by a smaller body, by different eyes, by a child's sense of scale. The memory was accurate to the experience, not to the measurements. This is a kind of Mandela effect without fandom, without debate. It's the collision of remembered reality and present reality, reminding you that memory is always tied to the person who remembered. We don't just remember facts. We remembered from somewhere, within a certain mood, a certain age, a certain set of hopes and fears. Memory is not detached observation. It is lived perspective. When perspective changes, the past changes with it. This is why the story matters beyond internet compilations. Because once you understand memory's fluid nature, you can begin to use it wisely, not to manipulate yourself, but to heal. Consider how trauma works. People who have endured painful experiences often replay certain scenes with intense clarity, yet other details disappear. The mind, overwhelmed, sometimes narrows its attention to the threat. Later, the memory carries the emotional charge like a live wire. In those cases, the goal is not to perfectly reconstruct every detail. The goal is to integrate the experience so it no longer controls the present. That integration often involves reinterpreting, finding context, meaning, and safety that the original moment lacked. That is memory rewriting itself in a compassionate direction. Or consider regret. A person remembers a choice they made years ago and sees it through the harsh lens of what they know now. They punish their younger self for not having wisdom that only time could provide. The memory becomes a courtroom, and the verdict is always guilty. But if memory is reconstructive, then it can also be reconstructive with mercy. You can revisit the scene and remember what you didn't know, what you were trying to survive, what you were hoping for. You can widen the frame. You can allow nuance back in. This doesn't change what happened. It changes what it means, and meaning shapes how the past lives inside you. In this way, the Mandela effect, stripped of spectacle, points towards something tender. The mind is not only fallible, it is adaptable. It can revise for harm, but it can also revise for growth. The same flexibility that produces shared misrememberings can also produce resilience. So perhaps the most important question isn't, how can we stop memory from being wrong? Perhaps it's, how can we use memory's flexibility without losing our grip on truth? That balance is the heart of adulthood. We learn to respect facts while also honoring the stories we carry. We learn that two people can remember the same event differently and both be speaking sincerely. We learn that the record matters, but so does lived experience. And we learn to say something that feels simple but is actually profound. I remember it this way, and I'm open to being corrected. That sentence is a bridge between inner life and shared reality. It keeps us humble without making us helpless. It keeps us curious without making us naive. In the end, the Mandela effect is a lesson in epistemic kindness, kindness toward ourselves and others in the face of uncertainty. because memory will never be perfect. But we can be honest about that imperfection. We can build systems, personal and cultural, that support verification. We can slow down before turning certainty into accusation. We can hold our recollections lightly, as treasures, not as weapons. So, as we approach the end of this journey, the mystery shifts once more. Maybe the real story isn't about whether history can be rewritten. Maybe it's about how we live when we realize our minds are always rewriting it anyway. If memory is a living manuscript, what do we choose to underline? What do we choose to soften? What do we choose to verify? And when the past feels unstable, can we anchor ourselves not in rigid certainty, but in the steady practice of seeking truth, with humility, with patience, and with a human heart? So we return to the beginning. A room, a statement, a shared certainty that shouldn't exist. A handful of people saying they remember a death that didn't happen the way they remember it. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you may feel a shift. The phenomenon no longer looks like a glitch in the universe. It looks like a window into the mind, into the way human beings carry the past like a lantern, lighting what matters and leaving the rest in shadow. The Mandela Effect can feel unsettling because it threatens a comforting assumption that memory is a dependable archive and that the past is fixed. But perhaps the more honest view is this: the past is fixed in the world, yet fluid in us. The record remains. The footage exists. The documents sit in drawers and servers. But the lived past, your past, exists as a reconstruction. It is built from fragments, reinforced by repetition, shaped by emotion, softened by time, and influenced by the stories you hear. This is not a defect. It is the cost of being human. We are not machines designed to store data. We are creatures designed to find meaning, to connect events into narrative, to protect the self, to survive loss, to grow. And meaning-making has a price. It can blur details. It can create certainty where there should be openness. It can turn the familiar into the true, even when the facts disagree. Yet there is also a gift in this imperfection, because once you accept that memory is flexible, you can stop treating every mismatch as a threat. You can meet it as a teacher. You can let it remind you that confidence is not proof, that shared belief is not automatically truth, that verification is a form of care, not an insult. And you can become gentler with yourself. You can say, I remembered that wrong, and it doesn't mean I'm broken. It means my mind works like a mind. It means I've lived long enough for time to layer itself over my memories. It means I've rehearsed certain stories until they became polished and familiar, even if they weren't precise. In that gentleness, something opens. Curiosity replaces defensiveness. Wonder replaces panic. Humility replaces the need to win. And humility is not the opposite of certainty. It is the foundation of wisdom. A wise person doesn't distrust their mind. They understand it. They recognize its strengths, its creativity, its pattern-making, its capacity for empathy, and its vulnerabilities, its susceptibility to suggestion, its desire for coherence, its tendency to confuse familiarity with fact. A wise culture does the same. It builds practices that honor memory without worshipping it, journalism that checks, education that teaches critical thinking, communities that reward careful speech, families that allow different recollections without turning disagreement into rejection. Because the future will demand this wisdom more than the past did. We are entering an era where images can be altered convincingly, where audio can be fabricated, where narratives can be engineered for speed and emotion. In such a world, the Mandela Effect is not just a curiosity, it is a rehearsal for the larger challenge of living with uncertainty. It teaches us to pause, to ask, how do I know this? Where did I learn it? What evidence supports it? What might I be filling in because it feels right? And it teaches us something even more important. The past is not only a set of facts, it is also a relationship between you and what happened, between you and the people who remember alongside you, between your inner story and the world's record. Relationships require humility to thrive. They require listening. They require the courage to revise. So perhaps the timeless question at the heart of this entire journey is not, did reality change? Perhaps it's this: when your memory disagrees with the world, can you hold both with integrity, the feeling and the fact, without collapsing into shame or suspicion? Can you let the mind be human and still choose truth? Because in the end, the most mysterious thing isn't that we misremember. The mystery is that we can look at our own fallibility and still keep searching, still keep learning, still keep trying to understand. That search, the willingness to wonder and verify at the same time, may be the most reliable thread we have. And if we follow it, maybe we don't need a perfect memory to live wisely. Maybe we only need a humble one.